We are working through what we call the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus didn't call that. The Bible doesn't call it that. We just kind of call it that because he was like on a small mound and hill by the Sea of Galilee, and it was a sermon that he talked about things that was his theme throughout his ministry. They kind of figured this is like the place that's all kind of put in one place. This is the kingdom message that Jesus brought. The first part of his sermon was what we call the Beatitudes, where he talks about the character of a kingdom person and the natural blessings that come to us when we live out these character traits in the kingdom. Then he calls us salt and light. We talked about that last week, telling us that when we live the Jesus way, when we live out the Beatitudes and the other things that we talk about in this sermon of the Mount, his sermon, that it blesses not only us, it does bless us, but it blesses all the people around us. It blesses our families, it blesses our neighborhoods, our communities, it blesses the state. Literally, it blesses the entire world because we're spreading Jesus everywhere we go, just through our lifestyle. Well, now Jesus transitions into some very specific teachings about the law that are going to sound a little bit different to his first century listeners. I mean, they'd been raised with the law, and they'd been drilled into them. Obviously, they didn't have like their own copy like you and I do of our own Bible, so they would go to synagogue or go into groups where people had scrolls. They would read from the scrolls, and the teachers would teach. And so he'll say a number of times, you have heard it said, you've heard people say, but I tell you. And he's going to get into that section now of his message. And it's going to sound, like I said, a little bit different than what they're used to hearing from the teachers that they had been taught from. But before he gets into this new twist of understanding of some parts of the law, Jesus has to kind of calm their fears that he's going to give them. Kind of a preemptive strike here. He calms their fears and reassures them, hey, I've not come to abolish the law. I'm not getting rid of what you already know or of your faith. We're not starting something completely new. We're taking something and fulfilling it. That's what he says in verse 17 in Matthew 5. He says, don't think that I've come to abolish the law and the prophets. They're all thinking, well, that's good, because I'd be out of here if you were doing that. I mean, no one wanted to hear that, right? So don't think I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but fulfill. So probably going, huh? I'm like, what? Okay. You got my interest. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or one stroke of a letter will pass away from the law until all things are accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commands and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never get into the kingdom of heaven. So he said, I'm not canceling the Old Testament, what we think of as the Old Testament. We're not canceling that out. You don't get to throw that away and say that's not for us anymore, that's for other people. Instead, he's coming to fulfill it. Jesus did not come to abolish, put that in print so it'd be big in front of you, right? Jesus did not come to abolish, but to fulfill the law and the prophets. Now, sometimes people will say, maybe you've said this or thought it or kind of directed your reading around this. It's like we don't really do the Old Testament, you know. I mean, we're a New Testament people, right? We don't need to bother reading the Old Testament. We live in the New Testament times. That's not true. That's an error. You're missing the richness of God when you ignore the Old Testament. That's why sometimes, well, we just went through Daniel a few months ago, November, December, January. Sometimes we'll go into the Old Testament because it gives us the richness of God and gives us his heart, really, for things. Or maybe you'll hear people speak out on moral issues. Usually they're trying to defend that something that the church says is clearly sin. They'll say, well, that's not sin, because Jesus never spoke directly to that, right? The Old Testament laws talked about it, but if you're going to follow that one, you have to follow all the Old Testament. You'll kind of throw that at you. How come you follow this one and not that one? How do you know which ones to follow? That type of argument that people will have. And honestly, that's a great point. That's a great question. How do you know which law of the Old Testament you are supposed to follow and which ones you're not? Jesus didn't abolish it. He came to fulfill it. So wait a minute, but so what do you do with that? How do we handle that as first century Christians? Here's a super simple way to approach this. If the New Testament tells you that a specific command has been fulfilled in Jesus, then it's been fulfilled in Jesus. Not abolished, it's just fulfilled. We just don't have to worry about it anymore. Jesus fulfilled that. We don't have to do it anymore. We don't have an altar here where you bring goats and lambs and pigeons to do sacrifices. We haven't done that in the church era because the New Testament clearly tells us that Jesus was the fulfillment of the blood sacrifice that was needed for forgiveness of sins. We just don't need to do that anymore. And it says over and over in multiple places. So we just don't deal with that. It's very clear. We don't set aside Saturday as our official day of worship. We don't participate in the Jewish feasts and all of the things of the Jewish calendar because the New Testament specifically says, oh, you're no longer bound by that. You can do them if you want. I mean, no one's going to stop you. Great. You can use Saturday as your Sabbath. Some say, well, I do Sunday, Saturday, whatever. Some people like to do some of the Jewish feasts. I've had people invite me to their house for Jewish feasts. It's kind of weird to me because I haven't grown up with that. But there's nothing wrong with it. But Paul makes it real clear, hey, don't hold people to that. Jesus fulfilled all that. That was simply a shadow of what was going to come. Those were all showing the Messiah was coming. Well, he came. He fulfilled all of that, so it's no longer necessary. Again, do it if you want, but it's not a command for us to follow. But when you come to many of the moral, any of the moral commands of the Old Testament, things like do not murder, right? Do not commit adultery. A man shall not lie with a man the way a man lies with a woman. These commandments that they're clearly spelled out in the Old Testament under the law are still binding on God's people today, just as much as they were in the Old Testament, because none of the New Testament writers ever said, hey, we're done with that now. It's no longer necessary. You guys get all carried away. Do what you want. Have fun. And they never said that. Jesus didn't fulfill that, so it's still there. And I bring that up because people will often argue that Jesus never specifically argued against homosexuality. Therefore, Jesus obviously was okay with it. I don't know if you've heard that argument before. I've certainly heard that before. Well, Jesus didn't specifically speak about homosexuality because the law already did. He didn't need to. God already told you his heart on the issue. And if it was going to be a change, then Jesus would have to address it. Hey, this is what God said, but this is where he's at. Now, he didn't do that. He left it alone. It tells us it's still binding. It's still part of God's heart and in his expectations for mankind. He did not come to abolish the law. The law is clear on issues of morality, so Jesus did not abolish those teachings. He did, however, fulfill the need to bring a sacrifice when you break those areas of the law. He is now your forgiveness. Because some of those you've broken, and you've had to go to Christ, I am so sorry, and the blood of Jesus on the cross covered you. You didn't have to take a goat, a lamb, or whatever to the sacrifice. Jesus fulfilled that part, but the moral code is still there. It still stands. As we move forward with Jesus' sermon here, he's going to quote parts of the Old Testament laws, some of the teachings that people would have heard from the Old Testament laws. And he doesn't relax or reverse any of the moral standards that we hear about or read about in this scripture. What he does is clarify the heart of God behind these laws. He says, not only should you not do certain things like the law says, but a kingdom person, if you're really honest, doesn't even want to do it. That's where it's going to get at with many of these issues. Before going on to these issues of the law, Jesus does say in verse 20, for I tell you, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never get into the kingdom of heaven. I want you to think about how intimidating that statement is to someone in the first century. You have to be better than the Pharisees and the scribes. These were the rock stars of their time. These were the spiritual giants of their time. These people, the average person didn't think they could even come close to comparing to the righteousness of these people. Well, Jesus, teaches other things, of course, as time goes on. But it's a very intimidating statement that these people heard. It's like telling a high school student, unless your basketball skills surpass that of Caitlin Clark, don't even think about joining our high school team. was like, what? Who's going to do that? How's that going to even happen? Or unless your singing and songwriting and marketing skills surpasses that of Taylor Swift, don't even think you're going to be part of our show choir. It's just not going to happen. It'll be, what? She's like the mega whatever star person. I can't do that. That's what they would have heard when Jesus says, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you're not in. You can't do this. So it was kind of a hopeless statement there at what they knew at that point. They're thinking, there's no way I can do this, and they would be correct. What they don't know is that Jesus himself would one day become their righteousness, which makes it work, But that's for them to learn a little bit later. So after setting them back a step, and they're like, well, wait, what? And they're kind of processing what he says. Jesus dives into the meat of some changes, some twists he's going to make. I should say some clarifications he's going to make in the Old Testament law. In verse 21, you've heard that it was said to our ancestors, do not murder. Right? That's in the law, right? It's in the Ten Commandments. It's one of the big ones, right? Do not murder. Whoever murders will be subject to judgment. Okay, everybody knows that. Everybody gets that, okay? Nothing new here. It says in verse 22, though, but I tell you, let's tell you what that really means, right? What God's really getting at here. But I tell you, everyone who's angry with his brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Whoever insults his brother or sister will be subject to the court. Whoever says, you fool, will be subject to hellfire. Anybody here ever been mad at anybody before? Maybe on the way to church? Somebody pulled out in front of you? Man. So the law says, don't murder anyone. Old Testament saint could technically tell themselves, I have not killed someone. But they could have wished they'd been dead. In their heart of hearts, they might hope they die prematurely. So technically, you cannot break the law, but in your heart, wish great harm on a person. You can quietly celebrate if they're run over by a drunk chariot driver and die an early death. You just can't be the one who kills them. And so, you can technically be all right, but still, there's a problem in the relationship. And Jesus is going like, let's get to the heart of the issue here. The heart of the issue is, don't let yourself get to the point where your anger allows you to even wish someone dead, or even just wish harm on someone. He talks about insulting them. Man, I grew up in a family with 3 boys. Insult was our love language, right? I mean, there wasn't a day that went by we weren't arguing, fighting, calling each other names, and the whole years of growing up, you're perfecting what name pushes the button the best of the brother. I mean, at least in my family, that's how it was. So I knew what it was to insult people and to be angry at people, calling them names, wishing they were dead. That's an awful thing to say out loud. But man, there were times, you get hit by a car. I mean, you say dumb things when you're a child and you're angry at your child brother. It's kind of what boys do. And Jesus says here, you know how bad it is when you murder someone? It's just as bad when you're angry at them. Let's dig into your heart here. Let's get into your soul here, because anger is the root of the issue that leads to murder. That's where he's getting at. If you insult your brother, he says you deserve to stand before the court. You call your brother a fool, you deserve the fire of hell. Seems kind of extreme. I mean, it seems really extreme. But that's his point. He did tell them, oh, by the way, your righteousness has to exceed that of the Pharisees. You're going to be perfect? You're going to perfectly make it through life? You can't even wish harm on someone. You can't let your mind go there for a moment. You have to exceed the righteousness of the Pharisees. You have to be better than them. And that starts with the heart. It starts with the heart. So how do you exceed the righteousness of the Pharisees? Not only do you not murder people, but you also guard your heart so that you don't hate anyone. so that you don't have a burning anger toward anyone. Jesus says if you have a problem with someone, fix it. Fix it before it grows out of control, before it festers. Fix it before that you get to the point where you hear their name or you see them walking your way and your first thought is a negative, like, it's them. Like, oh, so-and-so sick. Oh, good, I'm not going to see him today. They're not coming into the office, not coming to church or wherever today, right? Where your first desire is, I just want to tell them what I'm really thinking. You just want to insult them. Or you want to call them names, what is that? What Jesus say? Out of the overflow of your mouth, out of your heart is what comes out of your mouth, right? Because that's what's burning in your heart. You see them, and I just want to tell them what I really think. He's like, yeah, let's go ahead and cut that off. Let's cut that off before we get there. Don't allow yourself to get to the point where when you see someone, you just want to go up and punch them in the face. Maybe you don't have anybody. That's great. Good for you. That's awesome. But sometimes we'll have people in our lives that we're just like, they're just that sandpaper person. You just don't want, and you see them, they're just, it's a finger on the chalkboard thing. It's just, you're just not interested in hanging out with them. You've let that root of bitterness fester in your life. And what happens is it will consume you. It will progressively get worse if you don't fix it, if you don't deal with it. If you look at the rest of Scripture, anger is a pretty natural, even assumed human emotion. James 1:19 says, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. Of course you're going to be angry. You can't help that. Sometimes you're going to be angry. You're not going to be able to eliminate that from your life, but you can lengthen the fuse that it takes before you before you blow. The maturity, the growth process of it takes more to get me angry today than it did 5 years ago. Or are you the same? Have you grown in that area? Ephesians 4:26 says, be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger. You're going to be angry sometimes. The Apostle Paul gives us 2 instructions when you hit that anger point. Number 1, don't sin. Don't lash out. Don't say the thing you shouldn't say or do the thing you shouldn't do, whatever that is. Don't sin. And secondly, don't let it last. Don't let it linger. Don't let the sun go down. Immediately get that thing fixed. Oh, man, I just want you to know what you said made me really, really angry, and I'm embarrassed to say that out loud, but man, I'm really mad. Have the conversation and get the thing worked out. There's 2 words in the Greek text in the Bible that are used for anger. One refers to that quick flare-up that Paul talks about here. Somebody says something, and you're mad, you're throwing stuff, you're stomping out, you're so angry, right? That's one of them. Someone pulls out in front of you, and we've all had this happen. You're immediately like, bam, from 1 to 10. You're just like, you speed up rather than slow down. You're like, oh, I have little missiles in my car. I've blown up so many people, my imagination before. And I think, when do you outgrow that? I haven't yet. We deal with that. That's one of the Greek words that talks about this immediate explosion. But that's not the word that Jesus uses here in Matthew 5. It's a different word. The word that Matthew uses as he's quoting Jesus in his sermon is the second Greek word is the word orge. Orge. It's the kind of anger that sits and stews and slowly builds in your life. It's that feeling in the pit of your stomach that doesn't go away, like an order of greasy onion rings, and 6 hours later you're going maybe I should, I don't know about that. But this is an anger thing, and it just stays there and it sits there. The grudge over something that happened 5 years ago or 10 years ago or even longer, and you just haven't let it go. You haven't dealt with it. It's a memory that sits there and rots the inside of your soul. It festers. It consumes you. So the next time you see that person, or the next time that you are reminded of that person, or you hear that person's name, that rotting memory in the pit of your stomach reacts, and eventually your actions follow suit of some sort. They may not have done anything to you today, or when you see them, or when you spoke to them today, but it's that memory from the past that you haven't let go that is affecting the conversation today. I entered adulthood with some anger issues. So sometimes we don't even realize it. If you would have asked me at age 20, hey, are you angry about your dad? I would have said, nah, we're fine. It's all good. It's my dad, whatever. But I learned that I actually entered adulthood with some anger issues toward him. And it goes back from past memories. I learned early on that Dad really didn't want me in the house. The story is in our family that the day they brought me home from the hospital, Dad threw a plate of spaghetti at the wall because he was so angry that it's like, ugh, another boy. Now, in his defense, he had a daughter who died before I was born, and he was hoping for a girl. Well, it didn't work out for him. But he was, so that's the story I heard. I obviously don't remember that, but that's kind of like part of my upbringing. I heard that multiple times. Okay, Dad doesn't want me. His parenting style was not communication or building up. It was intimidation and yelling. My mom would always say, "Oh, he was a drill sergeant." Well, he really wasn't. He was a different kind of sergeant, but it was like, oh, he's an angry guy. So he was very, very always yelling, always negative about things. He was unfaithful to my mother, which I took personally, although it was against her, but still I was part of the family, right? He introduced me to one of his girlfriends at a bar when I was in 4th grade, and Mom was still at home, and they were still married. And I'm going like, wait a minute, what do you want? 4th grade, early in that year, figuring that whole thing out. And when they were going through a divorce, one night Mom grabbed us kids and we ran off to a hotel because Dad said he had a gun. He was coming out to get us. Those things kind of stick in your mind, and all those memories, they kind of start to add up. And I had pushed him aside. We're like, okay, he's still my dad, the relationship, blah, blah, blah. After the divorce, I'd spent a lot of time, all this stuff. I didn't hate him, although when they announced the divorce, I remember going to my friend's house just happy as a lark. Oh, they're fine. He's out. Finally, ha, 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 it was great. So there's some things I needed to deal with that I wouldn't have told you I needed to deal with. All those memories, I took them all into adulthood. I had to actually sit down and think about them for this. Like, okay, what are those things? There's probably stuff I haven't even mentioned that I just don't dwell on it, right? But I bring that up because at 20, I met this beautiful young woman, and I thought she probably needs to meet my dad because there could be a future with this girl. And I'm taking Cheryl. We were at the college. We left the college on the south side of Des Moines, and we were headed to Christopher's in Beaverdale to meet my dad. And she was going to meet my dad for the very first time. And so I was giving her this is just the warning. This is what my dad's like, just so you know, so that you can enjoy the evening. You'll just get this out of the way so you can expect this the kind of guy that my dad is. He's arrogant. He is self-centered. He is mean. He will speak really loud because he wants all the people on the tables around him to know how awesome he is, and he'll make sure and he's even looking around to see if they're looking and listening. You're going to have that experience. And I went through quite this long list of very negative character traits about my dad. And then we get to Christopher's, we sit down, we have our meal, we have a nice little conversation. I'm thinking, Cheryl's really learning what a guy he is, And we jump in the car, we're headed back to the dorm rooms, and she looks at me and she says, "Your dad is nothing like you described." I'm like, what do you mean? Because I probably, who knows what I keyed in on that thing, but she's like, he is nothing like you described. He was not mean. He was not obnoxious. He was not arrogant. He was not conceited. He was not loud. As a matter of fact, I had to ask him multiple times to repeat what he said because it was so soft that I didn't even know what he said. I'm like, what? What'd you say? And she said, that is not the person you described at all. He was very pleasant and spent most of his time asking about us and about our future. I don't even know that much about him yet from that one conversation, that one meal that we had together. For the next 10 years that Cheryl knew my dad before he passed away, she never, ever, she not once saw the guy I described to her on the way to Christopher's. That's the guy who was very alive in my memories. That's the guy I saw every time we met. Every time I heard his name, every time I wrote him, back then you wrote letters, that was the guy who I was addressing every time. And it was through that conversation with Cheryl going back to the college when she, said, no, that's not him at all. It caused me to reassess. It caused me to do some thinking and to process. And I realized I must have some unresolved issues here that I need to work on. It's not him. Apparently, it's me. I'm the one that's holding any type of relationship back. That anger had been stewing in my soul for years, to the point that I never allowed myself to see how much he legitimately changed once he came to Christ and allowed Jesus to transform him. I never saw it until Cheryl pointed it out to me. And then I started looking, I'm going, and as the years went on, I'm like, holy cow. He's not any of the things that I think of him when I talk about my dad. Once I changed my heart, that opened the door to a whole new relationship that we never had before. And that's why I always, whenever I talk to my dad, I always say, hey, we ended up in a great place. Because I had to figure out he had changed. And I needed to get over some things. So this is the word Jesus uses in Matthew 5 here. He isn't saying it's a sin to be angry. That just happens. You can't help that. What he's saying is a sin to remain angry. It is a sin for me at 20 years old to think at what he did when I was 8 years old and hold that against him. Dude, that was 12 years ago. That's not him anymore. It's not what he is anymore. What he's saying is a sin to remain angry, to let that bitterness fester and grow unchecked in your life to the point that it destroys relationships. How many relationships in this world have been destroyed because people didn't let go of their memory, of their event, and they projected it onto a person who maybe has changed. Now, sometimes they don't change, right? That's a different story, but they still have to deal with that on your end. Because you're the one who's captive if you're angry. You're the one who is held prisoner and who is hurting if you're letting it fester. You got to clear that up, is what Jesus is getting at here. Now, Jesus doesn't just leave it there and say, okay, good luck. He gives a solution in verse 23. So if you're offering your gift on the altar, you've brought your animal sacrifice or sin in your life, okay, you got to go to the altar, and there you remember your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift in front of the altar. First, go and be reconciled with your brother or sister, and then come offer your gift. Reach a settlement quickly with your adversary while you're on the way with him to court, or your adversary will hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the officer, and you'll be thrown in the prison. He's like, it's just going to keep getting worse if you don't fix this, you don't stop it, right? So truly I tell you, you will never get out of there until you have paid the last penny. Now, we don't do altars anymore. We don't do sacrifices, like I mentioned earlier, any longer. Jesus fulfilled those. So let's just skip to our world for a moment, in our setting, in our lives. You come to church to worship God. God to put something in your heart, an issue of a contention you have with someone else. You're saying, you know what? The highest priority in your life is to fix that. Use every ounce of energy you have to clear that up. Or it's going to get to the point where it will consume you. It will get to the point where it completely destroys a relationship, and any relationship you might have with that person. But not only that, it'll affect your health, it'll affect your life, your everything. It affects everything about you. There's nothing easy about this conversation, though. He's not saying this is the easy way. It requires some very difficult conversations. It requires facing some really hard issues. It requires complete openness and honesty. And not a judgmental, look what you did to me. It's just like, I just want you to know I've held this against you and I'm sorry. They might say, whatever, and that's on them. But I have to apologize that I have allowed it to affect you, my relationship with you. It requires putting on your big boy, your big girl pants, and looking someone in the eye and saying, hey, we have an issue. We really probably need to work this out. Is it easy? No. It's really hard. It's the hardest way, but it's the best way for sure. Because it leads to peace and life and reconciliation. It leads to the mercy that Jesus talked about earlier in the Beatitudes, and the healing of an infection that has been eating you up on the inside, working its way out. So do what you have to do. Have the conversations you need to have. Swallow your pride. Forgive whoever you need to forgive. Ask for forgiveness for you holding it against them. That's on you, not them. So that the kingdom of God will not be hindered. You've heard it said, do not murder. That's not the issue. It's your heart.